Hello and welcome back to another episode from Backlot 605 with the box office bonus episode. This week we're kind of doing a review of 2021, kind of see how did everything shake out this week. Joining me as always is my co-host Derrick Veurink. How you doing this evening?
Pretty good, you?
I guess I can't complain. So we figured, like you said before, is we're into 2022, but it's a good time just to kind of wrap up and kind of see, you know, 2021 was a really interesting year when it comes to movies and theaters and what was getting shown, what was getting pushed back, what was getting actually released, all sorts of things. So
Yep.
um, we're definitely gonna find. I think we're definitely gonna have some interesting numbers here. Probably nothing not that's not necessarily unexpected, but just that it's again, 2021's been a really weird year this year.
It has. It has. And I think that's what makes it very interesting to look back because, again, this time last year, theaters were still closed in many states.
Hmm.
Theaters or studios were reluctant to release their big hits, or if they were going to do it, it was going to be with a streaming or VOD component. So,
Yep.
this just made sense to look back here and see how far we've come in 12 short months. So,
Yeah, absolutely. So with that, getting into that here, we have the top 10 movies of 2021. So basically, this is the top shelf of everything that we've had going on this year. Um, and as we've been talking about the last couple weeks here and whatnot, no surprise here. Um, the one with the shortest amount of time, basically in the box office as of this right now, is also the one that's garnered the biggest payday, and that is
yep.
Spider-Man: No Way Home, which it hopefully this means good things for the box office, but I mean, I guess we'll see just depending on how everything kind of continues to ebb and flow with COVID and everything.
Yeah, I think the main thing to keep in mind here is, I mean, again, as we talked about when we got to opening weekend, certainly No Way Home was going to be the biggest movie since the start of the pandemic, but
Hmm.
I don't think I would have ever expected it to be one of the biggest movies of all time as it played
Right.
out. And I think it's important that I think the important lesson here is that people will still go to the movie theaters and show up for a movie at the very least when it's something that's a you know an event or a movie that's 20 years in the making, like Spider-Man No Way Home. It's going to have to be
Hmm.
the right kind of movie to get them back to the theater in such massive numbers, but it is doable.
Yeah.
And again, it's still got a long ways to go. It's still the number one movie in the nation, blowing everything else away. It's going to keep chugging along at least through the end of this month. So it's probably going to get to well over 700 million on this list, if not higher, when all is said and done.
Definitely. And what I do think is kind of fascinating about this list here too, of the top five that we have for this year, is there are a lot of people that they have a little bit of their superhero fatigue and stuff like that, and whatnot. But I mean, clearly between Spider-Man, Shang-Chi, we got Venom, we got Black Widow. So the top four of the top five movies of the year
Yep.
are Marvel properties. Venom, Marvel adjacent with the Sony production and whatnot, but these are all, Disney, Marvel produced movies and whatnot. And so whether you got the people that are going to say, well, there's just so many superhero movies. I think the only reason why people are kind of running into that thought process is clearly they're doing their job. They're bringing in the money, they're getting the exposure, and you know,
Yeah, I mean, those are the movies. I mean, even before COVID, I mean, those are the movies that were bringing people to theaters, and
hmm
certainly, they're the ones that are still doing it. I mean, we should mention we're recording this on Monday night, and just a few hours ago, we got the news that Sony was moving Morbius back a couple months,
right.
somewhat due to Omicron and theaters starting to close in Canada and stuff like that. And I know there's been conversation of, well, let's take Morbius to streaming. Let's take Morbius to VOD instead. But as you can see on this list, you know, Sony's made $825 million between No Way Home and Venom. based on
Hmm.
them putting their Marvel movies into theaters. So
Exactly.
their strategy behind what they're doing when you come down to it.
Well, and the other thing too with I agree with you just because it's a Spider-Man property, it's Sony. Sony's gonna do exactly like you said, what they did with Spider-Man, what they did with Venom and whatnot. Um, I've also heard the rumor is the reason why it got pushed as far as it did was simply because they're between Spider-Man slightly cannibalizing on it, but also to the Batman coming out in March.
Yep. Yep.
I mean, uh, as much as I'm looking forward to Morbius here, Morbius doesn't stand a chance against the Batman.
Oh no,
Uh,
no, no.
so I totally I mean this is one of those instances where I think Sony's making the smart move. I
Yep.
think pushing it past Batman is the smart thing to do. Sony does not have uh, that extra like digital service like a Disney Plus, HBO Max, everything like that to
Hmm.
lean against like a lot of the other studios have. So you know, um, it would have been interesting to see, where would Morbius had fallen had it actually gotten released earlier in the year because that was an early what July 2020 movie originally scheduled for.
That is correct. July
Yeah.
31st, 2020. So
So
it's
I
been
guess
moving around here a lot.
yeah. So I mean, I would have been kind of curious is if they took the chance with Venom and they stood by with Spider-Man and whatnot, why Sony didn't just try to push it out there because I think it might have actually had some legs and because I mean we look at Black Widow and Black Widow in comparison to other Marvel movies and Shang-Chi and Spider-Man looks underwhelming, but that was one of the ones that had that Disney dual release with the 30
Yep.
premium dollar access on Disney Plus, which
Hmm.
obviously we don't get those numbers. So,
No. Well, we did get that number on that first weekend that said they made 60 million globally just on Disney Plus
okay, that's right.
sales.
Yeah.
So that's one case where we did actually get that, but we don't know the final number on that. But Disney was confident enough in that movie's performance digitally that they're like, yeah, we'll give them those numbers. We'll actually brag about our digital performance for once.
Yeah,
So
yeah, is that the only one that actually did that? Because I don't think I heard anything
I
for
I
uh
I
because
think
Jungle Cruise did that too, right?
yeah, Disney gave a 30 million opening weekend Disney Plus number for that, but those are the only two cases
Yeah,
because Jungle Cruise was the last movie to have a premiere access release.
that's right. That's right. And in obviously in seeing here, rounding out the top five, is F9, the Fast Saga, which
Yep.
I mean, to be honest, this one honestly didn't surprise me, even with the June 25 release. At the time in June when this came out here, this was the first movie to break $100 million since COVID, right?
Uh, no, no. There is a movie in the next slide that we'll talk about that got there first. Actually, there
Oh,
were
okay.
several movies that got there first, but this was kind of like I know this was kind of like a big deal because this is the weekend I know when theaters kind of laxed their seating and buffering restrictions. There was the whole like cinema week endeavor was specifically timed around the release of F9. So they were trying to make a big deal about the release of this movie as kind of a welcome back to theaters in one way. And it sort of paid off.
Mhm.
I think it ultimately made what $700 million worldwide, which isn't
Yeah.
bad either for again the ninth installment in a 20-year franchise. So
Right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, and I'd say I mean for June, I'd say that's pretty solid, you know.
yeah,
And also too, I think Black Widow probably cannibalized a little bit on that because that was literally just a couple weeks later, and everybody was gonna go see Black Widow, or those that would anyway.
yeah. I mean, you kind of have to look at it in terms of stages because obviously F9 a big splashy blockbuster, but also Black Widow was kind of the first big Marvel movie in two
Hmm.
years.
Yep.
So that had a big cachet behind it too. But
Yeah. All right. So going in next here, we have the other 10, other five. So we got what looks like Eternals, No Time to Die, Quiet Place, Ghostbusters, Free Guy. What at least I like seeing about here is we have a little bit of a mix up, at least in studio wise here.
yep.
Um, but I mean, there is still Disney with Marvel's Eternals, Free Guy, which was their acquisition with Fox. But I mean, Sony's in here yet again with Ghostbusters. Where's Quiet Place fallen? Who's that
That's
again?
Paramount.
That's Paramount.
Yep.
And then MGM's No Time Today. So I mean, really, for the most part, most of the major studios at least got to have something in the top 10, with the exception, what, Lionsgate, clearly
Um,
isn't on here.
Warner Brothers is not on here for
Oh,
reasons we'll get into in a little bit.
I was gonna say, those, even before you even bring that up, I'm like, yeah, well, there was that whole thing here, but that which, I mean, again, that actually kind of gives us a bit of an explanation, though, once we do get into why we see that Warner Brothers isn't in the top 10. Um,
Yeah.
because there were some very good, solid movies that came out from Warner Brothers this year.
Yep.
And I guess the question, what these numbers do show us here is, is Warner Brothers in 2022 going to feel that idea aligned for them, financially,
Yeah. I mean,
because they're not in the top 10 at all.
yeah. I mean, I'll actually make the note here of the top 10 movies. Only one of those movies, Black Widow, had a day and date VOD or digital release component to them.
That's
Everything
true.
else was strictly theatrical only for at least their first 30 days.
That's
A lot of
true.
them had a 45-day window. But yeah, I mean, that's certainly going to be the signifier when you're talking about the top box offices. Certainly the movies that are strictly in theaters, and that's the only way you can watch them. That's what's going to rise to the top in this list because of that.
Yeah.
So,
Which, at least, I feel pretty good. I mean, I had an opportunity to see all of the. Yes, I had to think about that for a second there. Um, so, but I mean, it's definitely, now that you say that, it definitely shows that, people are wanting to go to the theater, wanting to go see, but at the same time too, it is clearly showing us that people are willing to stay home, pay a premium for a newer movie,
yeah,
um, if it means that it's going to be, something that they can do at their house. So I definitely think that, 2022 and going forward, I definitely think that the movie, not necessarily the movie going experience, but the how we watch movies,
yep,
and
how we
where
consume them.
we watch the movies, and why we do it, I think is going to be a huge factor going forward. And it's a good and a bad thing, and I totally get it from both sides, because the theaters want to stay up and running and whatnot. They need to rely on those concessions,
Yep,
stuff like that. But at the same time too, like me myself, if I've got a family of four and I can spend $30 renting a movie at home instead of spending 50, $60 at the theater for a
yep.
family of four, like, it makes sense.
Yeah, and I think the studios are still going to continue to make that call on a case by case basis in terms of what they will do. I
Hmm.
know right now in 2022, we really don't have, I think we've only got one movie that's actually going to do a dual release, and that's that J Lo Owen Wilson rom com of all
Mm,
things. But certainly not seeing the breadth of movies and the amount of movies from different studios that are taking that approach.
yeah.
The other thing I wanted to call out, and you really notice it with this list, is numbers 7 through 10 were all movies that were very um, hugely promoted prior to the COVID shutdown.
Hmm.
Because Quiet Place and No Time to Die, they were, again, I remarked this, I had bought my tickets for those movies when the initial shutdown occurred and those got canceled. Ghostbusters got promoted well before then. Free Guy did as well. Even if you look back at the top five that we talked about, F9 and Black Widow
Yep.
were also highly promoted, prior to that. And obviously that shows that the studios holding on to those movies and keeping them theatrical, those were big moves because, those were big movies. And certainly their box office showings are clear indication that, it was worth waiting for those because lots of people still showed up for those movies. So
Yeah, I would definitely agree. Yeah, for me it was F9 and A Quiet Place 2 because I was gonna go see that
double feature.
double feature of A Quiet Place, and I was sadly disappointed because I never saw the original one in the theaters, and that would have been perfect.
Yep.
Uh, but yeah, I mean, it is very interesting to see. You are absolutely correct. Um, even with like No Time to Die, you and I both were like, just don't change the release date before I actually show up to the theater with as many times as MGM. But I mean, that just goes to show, like, um, you know, we'll get into the Warner Brothers thing, but I mean, like, MGM again didn't have like a Disney or a Disney
No.
Plus or an HBO Max or something like that to lean on. So, you know, MGM's doing everything they can to get this out at an optimum time to get the most bang of their buck.
Yep.
Same with Sony with Ghostbusters. Paramount only has really started to kind of get their footing um with their streaming service, and they're not quite to the cusp of like a Netflix or the HBO Max or anything like that. So, you know, I could certainly see you definitely get that feel of these studios that don't have the streaming services to lean on. You know, yeah, all these ones that had all these release dates just get pushed and pushed and pushed until we finally got them out, and obviously it clearly at least somewhat paid off for them. I guess I say somewhat because depending on what budgets were, and there's probably a lot of movies that look like they made a lot of money but clearly did not.
Yeah. Yeah. That's probably a fair way to put it too. So
Yeah. All right. So now we have, as we were talking to here, is the dual release stuff here, where we have day and date release. It comes out to the theaters, but it's also coming out at home in various means and manners. Um, I do like the fact that you did put in here the premium access stuff with like Disney Plus, but then we have like say Dune and Godzilla with HBO, and Halloween with Peacock here. What I find fascinating about this is Jungle Cruise and Black Widow both still take the number one spot,
yep.
and yet they still had spots where if you wanted to watch it at home, you were still paying a premium to do so.
Yep.
Where with the respect of Dune, Godzilla, and Halloween Kills, as long as you had those services,
Yep.
you weren't paying anything extra. So
Yeah. I mean, that probably is a big signifier as to how Black Widow and Jungle Cruise probably were able to rise up against the others.
hmm
And as soon as Disney started this premiere access concept with Mulan back in 2020, there was always that thought of, well, Mulan's one kind of movie, yes, but there was always that thought of, well, what if they try this out for an MCU movie? And obviously, they got their one chance to try it. Or
Yep.
what if we do it on a standard Disney animated movie, which they did with Raya and the Last Dragon? Or just a general Disney live action tentpole, which is what they got with Jungle Cruise. I mean, even though that experiment is, for all intents and purposes, over, as far as
Yep.
we know, they still got to try out, a bunch of different movies in here. They also got Cruella out there as part of that plan, which just missed this top five.
Yep.
Not that far below Halloween Kills, to be perfectly honest. Um, so that's the deal. I mean, obviously, with the HBO Max deal, there was a lot more under that umbrella because it ended up being 17 movies, if
Yep.
I counted correctly. That includes the first one from 2020, which was Wonder Woman 84.
Yep.
And so, obviously, it does leave a little bit of a sting when you realize that only two of those movies actually made it to $100 million at the box office. But of course, Godzilla versus Kong was kind of one of those big fan-driven movies, as well as kind of like one of those, probably the first real big blockbuster once most theaters actually started reopening, which I think was
Yeah.
a big deal. And then Dune, obviously, there was the excitement about this adaptation where they're gonna knock it out of the park, which they did. The hope of can it do well enough to justify Dune Part Two, which it ended up doing. Those movies had some big things going for it, but then you also look back and see the movies that Warner Brothers put out that ended up not doing so well, probably because of HBO Max. Things like the Suicide Squad underperforming, or the
Hmm.
Matrix Resurrections, not doing that well during the Christmas holiday, stuff like that, and of course a bunch of other movies that were kind of more apt for the HBO Max platform in the first place, like King Richard or the Sopranos movie. We kind of saw a wide range, because they decided, well, we're going to put out every movie we have on HBO Max. You really kind of saw those discrepancies, and I think a lot of the smaller movies really ended up performing very poorly at the box office because most people were indeed inclined to just watch those movies on streaming, which so be it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's just it. I mean, if there's one thing that the HBO Max thing kind of did for me anyway, is it, not, I mean, obviously I had the choice of how I wanted to watch and consume those movies and whatnot. But also too, like you said, like the King Richards, like the little things and whatnot. Some of these movies, the advantage is that I watched a movie that I probably may not have gone to the theater to go see anyway.
Yep.
So it got my eyes on it because I have HBO, and I'm like, well, heck, if I don't have to pay anything extra, so of course I'm going to sit down and watch this brand new movie.
Yeah.
So at least maybe, if anything, if this has done anything for HBO, is it's or not HBO, excuse me, Warner Brothers has said, okay, we do have this service that we can lean on in terms of content and content distribution, going forward when we make movies and whatnot. Excuse me. you know, are we going to shoot for a theatrical release, or are we shooting for an HBO Max release, kind of thing, to help, maybe we make a big time movie, but it'd be HBO Max to drive subscribers.
Yeah, and I mean that's exactly what they are doing. Because like I know Steven Soderbergh, he's made two movies specifically for HBO Max. He's got a third one coming out in either, I think it's February, and then they announced that Magic Mike 3 is also going to be direct to HBO Max.
Hmm.
And they've got a bunch of others that are going straight there too. But the other thing to bring up is starting in 2022, Warner Brothers movies will go to HBO Max 45 days after they open in theaters. And
That's right.
that's going to start with Warner Brothers' next movie, which is The Batman on March 4. So around April 19th, that's when it's actually going to show up to stream on HBO Max. So a little bit back to normal, or at least giving them that 45-day window, which will most likely be the norm going forward.
Yeah.
But we'll see how that influences behavior, in terms of how many people will decide, I can wait to watch it on HBO Max versus, well, I'm impatient and want to watch that in the theater now. So
Yeah.
that'll be interesting.
It's starting to remind me of, like the 80s, where, you went to go to the movie, you went to the movies, you went to go see your movie, and because it didn't come out on VHS until, a few years later, that if you wanted to watch it before you were able to go buy it, you
Yep.
went to you went to HBO.
Yep.
So it does feel like there's a little bit of that kind of resurgence again on how we consume movies, and when is content going to be available for us to buy and whatnot.
Yep.
Um, so it's interesting. I never thought in a long time, if it weren't for COVID and whatnot, like that, like 90-day window between theatrical release and when can I go buy it at the store and whatnot, was pretty solid. Like 3 months seems like a good solid. I mean, you can't get really much more shorter than that. And then COVID said, I can change your mind.
Yeah. And the funny thing was the 90-day window was actually relatively new as well, because that only
Hmm.
started when Disney put Alice in Wonderland, the Tim Burton one, out on video 90 days after theaters. Because before then, it was like 120 days, if not more. So
Yep.
gradually, they've been trying to shorten it, But of course, the theaters have always put up that fight in terms of, well, we need to maintain our ground and have that window. And then, of course, COVID gave the studios the incentive to shorten it. Now, granted, there are always going to be exceptions. The big one that always comes to my mind is that Christopher Nolan, per his contracts, mandates 100 days in theaters before they come to video. And
Hmm.
when he took his next movie to Universal, that was one of his big items in his contract. And Universal said, yeah, we'll do that. anything to have Christopher Nolan under our portfolio. So we'll still see all these variances. Obviously, I'll try to keep track of them, as best as I can over the course of the year as we kind of get back to a
Normal.
semblance of normal. But it's a new normal in that respect too. So
Hmm.
it'll be interesting to see how everything plays out.
Yeah, it was back when I used to rent videos and whatnot. I have a lot of people be like, "Oh, when's this gonna come out?" Be like, and go look for the theatrical release and be like, "Okay, so if I do the math, about here, but don't quote me on that until I get you an actual date." So, all right.
All right.
So, in terms of a local stuff that we've got here, the Sioux Falls State Theater, our historic state theater that celebrated its 1 year anniversary on the 11th of December. You decided to give us a little bit of their top 10 movies. Now, obviously, the one thing that we keep in mind with the state is that they know that they're not going to be able to compete with like the first run Cinemark stuff and whatnot. So they're much into the repertory screenings and the little things that the big guy won't do, like what, like Teton and Lamb and shoot, oh,
like
come on,
like the
oh
the, the beta list and upcoming stuff like Benedetta or Macbeth. So
yes,
yeah,
Red Rocket.
exactly that.
Awesome. So I what I find fascinating here, well, okay, I should say I find it fascinating, but I don't at the same time too, is this clearly shows, number one, people like going to the movies during Christmas, and number
Yep.
two, people really like Christmas Vacation.
Yeah, I mean, I think to set some of the context for this, for starters, the state had only gotten up to full seating capacity around the 4th of July weekend.
True.
And that's very noticeable because one of the movies that played that 4th of July weekend, which both you and I went to, was The Goonies, which landed at number 3 because people love The Goonies. Um, and of course, it was very interesting to watch, all these Christmas movies play at the state, because the state really went into programming as many bona fide classics as they could. And of course, it's very fun to watch some of these movies with a crowd.
Right.
I will be the first to admit they showed Christmas Vacation 3 times at the state, and I went to the state all 3 times because seeing that in a packed house with a crowd, you know, even though I saw other comedies like Elf or A Christmas Story there, Christmas Vacation is kind of the most ruckus, you know, movie of that bunch to watch with an audience. So I can totally get that.
Hmm.
But of course, Christmas Story was fun too, and even, I know as we were marking ourselves, on Thanksgiving weekend when Elf was playing, and they were even like adding a showing on Black Friday to accommodate the demand, which was pretty telling how well that was doing. But then you also have The Sound of Music in here, which actually just played this Christmas week, and actually ended up doing so well that they decided, well, right after the new year, we're going to add a couple more showings because our original showings sold out and people really love that movie, believe it or not. So it's just been fun to kind of see the state respond in real time to these movies, selling out very quickly and adding more shows to let people see them there too, which is always great.
And that's one thing I do like about the state too, is that they definitely see, you know, that the fans are coming out and whatnot, and if time allows and whatnot, they're easily able just to get in, get that extra showing. If they're going to play it some more, they're definitely keeping an eye on, who's coming out, what they're coming out to, and what they need to do to try to get more people to come out.
Yeah, and I know there's already been some indications from the folks at the state that come December of 2022, they will be much more prepared and try to fit in as many showings as they can of these movies, even if it
Hmm.
might be like operating 7 days a week to bring the crowds in. It'll be, obviously this was kind of a very big and successful month for them, which I'm glad for.
Yeah.
And it'll be fun to see, how they handle it next year, knowing what they know now. So
Oh yeah. Well, and as we start to kind of get into somewhat of a quote unquote norm and whatnot, and as people get used to the fact that they have the state as an option for movie goings and whatnot, because you and I both run into people going, "Oh, the state played this, or
Yep.
oh, I didn't know this or this, just because they've been around a year, but there's just, I wouldn't call it necessarily a stigma, but when you haven't been around for 30 years, it's not the first thing in people's minds.
No, and I think part of it too might be like, oh, I'm just going to check Fandango to see what movies are playing. Well, the
Yep.
state isn't in there, so it may not exist. Maybe that's part of it too.
I would honestly think that's a lot of part of it here, just because you and I both, like if we're gonna go look for a new release movie, we go to our Cinemark app, that
Yep.
sort of thing. You and I both know to go check out for the state and whatnot, but you're right. There's not a lot of people that immediately think about that, and that could be said true for like the West Mall as well.
Yeah.
you know, so
But I mean, to the point, I mean, for all these movies that we're talking about, at least in the top 5, and even a number in the top 10, those were still sellout showings
hmm
in most cases. So I think it is making enough of an impact where they're still able to, you know, bring in the big audiences for these movies and make them work here locally. So that's cool too.
yeah, definitely looking forward to all everything else that they've got yet to come. Because as we bring in two here, and this kind of brings up to like what I was saying before, is this is giving us a little bit of the top in the 6 through 10 is a mix of the repertory and the new release here, because again we have It's a Wonderful Life, an absolute classic film that it is, followed by Nomadland, which was a brand new release here this last year from Chloe Zhao. Then we go into White Christmas. Now, my question to you for White Christmas here, because they play this for the anniversary as well. So is this for the 2021 or the 2020?
This is only taking into account 2021 showings because both White Christmas and It's a Wonderful Life played in 2020, but
That's
these
right.
attendance figures only reflect the year 2021.
Nice. Yeah. And then, like I said, French Dispatch, which is a brand new film and whatnot. And then the Rob Reiner classic Princess Bride. So I do look at some of the movies on this list, and since just for my own scheduling and not able to go see, I do hope, with like the sake of like White Christmas and A Wonderful Life, is that some of these other ones will make their way back at some point here. Because I mean, if I remember correctly, I was completely out of town during the weekend of The Princess Bride, and I'm like, this is one I need to have on my list of movies to have seen at the state. And but it just goes to show again, classic the classics are also pulling their weight there.
Yeah, I mean, first off, to the point of It's a Wonderful Life and White Christmas, I mean, they've kind of already established the fact that they've already shown the first December they were open, and they showed this past December. So those are going to be annual traditions. And I'm
hmm
sure many of the other Christmas movies that played this year will also return bigger and um, excuse me, in 2022 as well. Um, you know, other movies like Princess Bride, I'm sure they'll come back eventually. It's going to be the tricky thing with those non-seasonal movies is obviously they want to work through, you know,
Oh,
other
absolutely.
all-time classics as well first before they go into repeating stuff, but it's certainly possible. Nomadland is a special case because again, this opened in theaters nationwide back in February,
hmm
where there were still seating restrictions. Um, and the state had played this actually for 2 weeks with a showing every day, 2 weekends to get to that number, even though only 60 to 70 people. Movie stuff like Nomadland or Raya and the Last Dragon. And the West Mall 7 was actually closed at this time, so
hmm
they were actually able to benefit from that immensely. Plus, also the South Dakota connection. We can't forget that. I think drew a
Right.
lot of people out to that movie as well. And with the French Dispatch, this was a very interesting case because this had actually played at Cinemark for a few weeks in November prior to it coming to the, and as much as I was excited they were bringing the French Dispatch to the state, I kept wondering, is this going to be successful enough considering that a bunch of people in town already saw it at Cinemark? But the fact that it played well, and again, they added another showing this coming weekend to accommodate the demand, that's pretty key too. And
Definitely.
the other thing I'll say to that is, I know in the lead up to French Dispatches coming out, I think I read one person in a like Variety article or something say Wes Anderson movies are to art houses what Marvel Studios movies are to cineplexes in terms
There,
of
it,
blockbusters.
that is a very, very accurate assessment.
Yeah,
And this is coming from a person who has seen very little of his work, but that is a very accurate assessment. The other thing I kind of wanted to throw out there too, specifically with Nomadland, um, is you know because we opened up Nomadland at the state during its opening weekend or
that's right.
in that time frame, right?
Yep, yep. Opening weekend.
Yeah. The reason why I wanted to bring that up is because that was one of the few that got a dual release
Yep, on Hulu.
and on Hulu because that, again for me, unfortunately, scheduling and whatnot, Hulu, I think I got it to like a week or two later or something like that. But I watched it on Hulu. So the fact that it in a time when people are staying home watching movies and getting it on the content of what they already have and whatnot, and Hulu is a relatively popular service. The fact that No Man Land was still able to be successful, kind of in the same vein of like what you said with like the French Dispatch. You know, they had just seen it at the Cinemark and everything like that. But the No Man Land is that type of movie that is like the bread and butter of like what the state is looking to try to bring in the first place. Those are the movies that the people that go into the state are the people that want to see a movie like No Man Land.
Yeah, and to be honest, when you look at the timeline, I mean, Nomadland was also kind of the state's first big new release movie of sorts, which I
Hmm.
think also helped because you still had a bunch of demand with people who were trying to get to the state for the first time. Obviously those early showings of like White Christmas and Wonderful Life and Home Alone sold out very quickly with the
Right.
capacity restrictions. So I think that kind of filtered. Ultimately people got out there for this movie. As well as it was just a very lucky bit of timing on their part because they ended up being the only theater that showed that in town, for its first several weeks. So
Yeah. And like you said, I think the South Dakota connection for No Man Land and being in the historical state theater probably helped to its advantage.
oh yes, oh yes.
All right. Oh, excuse me. Huh. Oh, pardon me. I will give her this cold eventually. So that being said, that is the year in review for the box office, and more specifically our local state theater. I definitely look forward to seeing what the state has more yet to come for 2022. Um, are there anything that you've seen at least as currently and whatnot is what is probably going to be like the big ones that we're going to be talking about for 2022?
Well, that is actually the topic of next week's box office bonus. If
Well,
we want to leave that as a teaser,
then
so
we will leave that as a teaser. Absolutely. All right. So with that, we will just end the show. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterbox HQ. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, Amazon, and our pretty faces on YouTube. And be sure to support us at Patreon at patreon.com/backlot605. That again has been our box office bonus episode of the week, and we will check you out here next week.
see ya.